what do you think of the zero draft as it is now?
I think it's a good starting point. I think that it's potentially not as strong as we would have hoped for, but not as bad as we might have feared. Overall, I think it is a very good document that gives us the ability to negotiate on a number of points. So it's very broad. It covers off most of the points, I think, that had been in the discussions to date, and therefore it is a starting point for figuring out the details behind each of those points. Again, it's short, it's only 19 pages, so it's fairly manageable, and what we now need is something that is expressive of how we achieve the ambitions that we've always known that we need to sort of achieve.
So what's good about it? You say it's not as bad as you sort of feared.
Well, there are a few different elements. I mean, the things that are mentioned quite strongly are the need for green economy roadmaps, the need for sustainable development goals, a successor framework to the Millennium Development Goals. On the governance side, developing a Sustainable Development Council, which would be on par with the Security Council, reporting to the General Assembly. Again, on the institutional side, ombudspeople for future generations. These feature quite strongly. There's a strong call for corporate sustainability and reporting. There's good use of the Rio principles, the original Rio principles, throughout the document as the rationale and basis for the need for action on some different points. And specifically on the point on science, there's a very strong call for the enhanced integration between the use of science and policy making. I would stretch that more broadly to decision making, but it's a very good call. So there's quite a few good examples throughout where I think the UN has done very, very well in sort of highlighting some issues strongly. There are still a lot of gaps and potential weaknesses, but on the whole, I think it's much more on the positive side than the negative side as a starting point of a zero draft document.
What are some of the weaknesses of the draft as it is now?
Well, I mean, there's a very strong emphasis on growth, whether that's described as economic growth or green growth, and these issues of describing a economic model that we've always subscribed ourselves to, without really recognizing the scientific imperative of the fact that we live on a planet that has defined limits, and these limits aren't actually discussed. It's mentioned twice around the carrying capacity of the Earth, but concepts like environmental limits, planetary boundaries, tipping points, thresholds, these things aren't mentioned, and I think it's because of the politics behind it. And it becomes a really risky situation where we are politicizing a process that actually needs to be based on science, sound science. And decisions should be made on what the science is telling us to do rather than what the politics are dictating. So yes, I realize, and we all know, that we're in an economic downturn, an economic crisis, and that there is a need to find people jobs and continue to grow. But that, I think, is predicated on an outdated model of thinking that GDP is the measure of success. And I think that we need to think more broadly beyond that. And by thinking in those ways and embracing the scientific evidence, that we can find ways and new pathways to growth that don't necessarily use GDP as the be-all and end-all measure of progress.
So you think that the focus on the sort of green growth and the economic development per se is not quite right? It shouldn't focus on that?
Well, I mean, what we're talking about here is GDP growth, whereas what we're after is prosperity and well-being. I mean, we're talking about outputs or outcomes, and I think we need to be very, very clear on what we actually measure, and that should be based on what we fundamentally value. Is it the health and well-being of the people on the planet, or is it the sort of growth of wealth and the consolidation of that wealth in the hands of a few, and while we see huge growing inequality gaps between the rich and the poor worlds? The Millennium Development Goals were put in place to reduce that gap, and yet we see, in absolute terms, the poverty gap widening from year to year.
Mm-hmm. So with the, you mentioned Millennium Development Goals, and the Zero Draft mentions them as well, and says the government's sort of agreed that Millennium Development Goals should be achieved, and then it suggests the Sustainable Development Goals as well, but it doesn't give any specifics on what those should be exactly, and kind of gives 2015 as a year for when they should sort of coming in to replace the MDGs.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what your view was on that part of the Zero Draft. Are you happy with the Sustainable Development Goals and how they were tackled in here?
I actually don't mind it. I think that there's also an issue of pacing behind the negotiations of Rio. I think that it's important, given the way things have gone to date, that we see Rio+20 not as a signing off point of a bunch of brand new initiatives, but a starting off point of things to come. The negotiations have started much later. I think in 1992 you would have seen that back 2-3 years before the conference things had begun. And we've compressed all of that into 1 year's time. So I think that if you push too hard, so going back to the point on pacing, if you push too hard and too soon, too fast, you'll find some fragmentation, and people will begin to argue about what these Sustainable Development Goals look like in practice. Mm-hmm. And people will begin to splinter in their views, and we'll end up with a very, very weak outcome in the Rio document itself. And what we should be doing instead is getting an agreed perspective on the need for these new goals and what the process would look like in terms of arriving at these goals. Mm-hmm. And we still have a very clear time period with which the Millennium Development Goals run until 2015, and that's the time in which we can actually get into the details of the metrics and indicators that we use to measure them, and the detail of what the Sustainable Development Goals look like. What's important now is to get universal agreement on the need and the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think what's here now is, it's good, it's a good starting point. I don't think that describing the metrics in detail is actually the task for right now anyway.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to future versions, I mean, how much scope is there, do you think, for new things such as that to be added to the draft? So, by the time of Rio in June, do you think issues such as new emerging technologies could be pushed through by NGOs if they're not already in the Zero Draft?
I certainly think so, yeah. I mean, knowing the people specifically here at the UN who are very hardworking, very industrious, I think that they're very receptive to these kinds of ideas. I'm sure they would not claim that the Zero Draft is a perfect document. It is just a starting point for the negotiations based on taking a 6,000-page compilation document down to 19 pages. How you could possibly capture everything in that practice is basically impractical. So there are going to be things that might be missed, given the sort of process of trying to prioritize. I think that, however, the view of the NGO should not be to sort of rally around and sort of scream from the outside about issues, but to work with governments and the UN to get these things in place. I mean, this is a negotiation process of the United Nations, not of the NGOs. And I think the NGOs need to be very clear about working constructively with nation states rather than just sort of complaining about what's not there. Mm-hmm. And that's the only way in which these things will get into the document. But I do think that if that constructive approach is taken, that many new things can be introduced to the document, and it's far from a closed book.
Mm-hmm. And do you see, I mean, are there any specific parts or fields that should be included that aren't included in the current draft? So,
well, again, to go back to my first, one of my key points about this need for environmental limits and planetary boundaries. I mean, this is a key concept in sustainable development. For it not to be explicitly mentioned is, for me, a dangerous oversight. Again, politically, I can understand why developing countries don't like the mention of limits to growth, because they feel it's a developed country paradigm which is being foisted upon them to limit their growth and sort of maintain their position in the sort of economic order, and that we've been allowed to develop to a certain standard, and now, because of environmental reasons, they're not allowed to do the same. So I understand the difficulty about addressing it, but it can be complemented. That concept can be complemented with another concept, which is the social protection floor, which is in there, but has got a very, very weak measure. And bringing together planetary boundaries or environmental limits with the social protection floor to describe a banded area in which we live sustainably is, for me, a fundamental concept of sustainable development, and something that needs to be explored a lot better in this document. Mm-hmm. Additionally, population, another major elephant in the room, is not mentioned at all. I think that I don't know how you can talk about these issues seriously without considering population and the growth that's going to come over the next few years, from 7 billion to at least 9 billion in 2050. This is exponential growth, and it is going to cause major sustainability impacts over time. Population, of course, is coupled with sustainable consumption and production, or unsustainable consumption and production patterns as we see them now, the rising middle class throughout the world, and people striving for, let's say, Western standards of living means that consumption and production patterns are becoming increasingly unsustainable. You then combine that with just more people on the planet. How do you work out this problem? It's an equation that doesn't seem to sort of add up to me at the moment. And all the elements of that equation aren't even in this paper. And until we do that, we're not going to come to a very good answer, are we? So I think that those are two things that need to be in there. Again, talking about your point on finance, I think that there's another major missing area that needs to be looked at a lot more clearly, with a lot more detail, and basically quite a lot more ambition and boldness about what we're saying. We have these problems, they're recognized. Now how are we going to finance them? And then of course that links to implementation. Stakeholder Forum has done a big study for the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs on the implementation of Rio principles and the Agenda 21 study over the last 20 years, which is going to be available on the website, which describes some of these problems and looks for ways forward. And I hope that some of that thinking will be brought into the Rio process as well. Lastly, I think that better use of science. It does have a good mention, science, but things like an intergovernmental panel on sustainable development, a panel of experts for science, reporting directly to a new Sustainable Development Council is another really important institutional mechanism that doesn't get any mention. I think that such a panel that has sort of oversight as well over the IPCC as well as the biodiversity panel would actually add a lot of intellectual rigor in terms of the interlinkages of these problems and the solutions that need to go along with it. I think these are the important things that we now need to look for in the Zero draft, and to put back in and provide a comprehensive package of measures that work together. At the moment it's quite just a list of things, and I don't necessarily see myself the interlinkages between the different things in the Zero draft. And what needs to happen is not only sort of filling the gaps, but also taking the whole package and making it work as a cohesive outcome document which actually delivers things in a more linked up way. So you get, if you are producing a Sustainable Development Council, why wouldn't they have an advisory scientific panel which helps them make decisions? I mean, that for me follows as part of good governance. So I think these issues also need to be thought of now as we go forward in this process.
And the draft also sort of mentions some of the regions and countries that are most likely to be affected by these environmental changes.
Yes.
And how good is this document from a sort of developing country perspective? How good is it for the sort of least developed countries and for the sort of small developing islands? Does it address their issues enough, do you think?
I think it gives a good airing to their issues and to the risks they face. However, I don't think it necessarily really fundamentally addresses what the drivers of those risks and threats really are, which again go back to this issue about a business as usual growth at all costs agenda for the sort of economic model we've created over the last 200 years, in particular in the last 50 years. And within that, this issue of consumption and production patterns. Ultimately, they do a reasonably good job of describing the threats, but what's causing the threats? It's the way in which people live in other parts of the world. And without addressing those issues, what's the point of just nicely highlighting the fact that these people are actually quite screwed? We got to make the link, and without those links between the fact that people in Small Island states are basically screwed because they're going to be underwater in say 20 to 50 years because of rising sea levels, along with the acidification of the oceans on which they rely. And if we don't make a link to that, to our behaviors here in London or New York or anywhere else in the developed world, and the way in which we live our lives, and the impact that has on someone else's lives in another part of the world, it's going to be an impossible mission. And again, it cuts back to both education, so raising the awareness and making people the link of those issues in people's minds, but then also gendering the values and within them that they actually want to do something about that. And until that happens, and I don't think it does that in this document, because if you talk about those threats, but then don't say, for example, that consumption is a major driving and contributing factor to that threat, then it's not going to happen, is it? I don't think it does that very well.
And just final question is, there's lots of conferences going on at the moment, and leading
Sure
up to
is,
Rio.
yeah.
And I was just wondering, how important are those in terms of bringing these issues, to back to negotiating tables? So how important are those for maybe putting some things back into the draft, or are lots of these conferences just for show?
No, I think there's still a lot to play for, and I think actually because of the fact that these negotiations are so close and there's still so much to do, I think that sort of almost external conferences, discussions, creating partnerships offline from the actual formal Rio process, working out issues and then coming back with agreed positions is absolutely paramount of importance here. The risk is that if we just rely on the formal process, when things go wrong and when disagreements come up, that they will bog down the formal discussions, Rio will suffer from lack of progress, and the outcomes themselves will be weakened, less good than they could have been. So I see that all of these external events, even though there's a lot of them, they're vitally important in terms of risk reduction and taking out some of the risk of the formal process of Rio by having some of the battles outside the process. And even less formally, partnerships should begin to form around these different issues where people feel passionate about something, and they should look to identify even minor conflicts of views they have between themselves. And ironing out these discrepancies will be very important so that when they come back to the negotiating table, they come back with a very clear view on, say, renewable energy and what they want and what the exact wording should be in the Rio document. And they should be able to just insert that in. And it's all about finding the most efficient ways to make meaningful progress on getting the best outcomes of Rio we can.